The Subcommittee on Information Technology and Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning. Welcome to today's joint hearing on the 7th FITARA Scorecard. In the 4 years I've been fortunate enough to serve as chairman of the IT Subcommittee, we've held 40 hearings on a wide variety of technology, privacy, and cybersecurity issues. In one of the subcommittee's first hearings back in 2015, seems like a long time ago, we examined encryption technology and potential U.S. policy responses. This is an issue that's still with us today. We investigated the devastating OPM data breach, an early example of what would become a familiar story: legacy IT and poor cybersecurity practices being exploited by hackers with devastating consequences. Again and again, we've heard this story, most recently with the Equifax data breach, one of the most harmful in U.S. history. More than half the American people were touched by that. It's just unbelievable how staggering that was. This subcommittee examined electronic health records, interoperability at the DoD and VA, and pushed the departments to finally adopt the same system. Novel idea. We held hearings on issues as varied as the Internet of Things, federal political advertisement laws and regulations, and the cybersecurity of voting machines. All of these hearings and issues are important, and I'm proud of the positive results that follow. But the issue that has commanded the most time and attention by far from this subcommittee during my tenure has been federal IT acquisition and management. This is the 7th time the Information Technology and Government Operations subcommittees have assembled to review agency FITARA scorecards. Beginning in 2015, committee staff worked on a bipartisan basis with GAO to develop a scorecard to assess agencies' FITARA implementation these efforts. FITARA Scorecard 7.0 shows improvement across the federal government since the prior scorecard in May of 2018. 11 agencies increased their letter grade, 13 remained the same, and there were no decreases. I think this is the first time. One of the key areas the committee has emphasized in FITARA implementation is Cio Authority. In particular, the reporting chain for the agency CIO. 8 agencies continue to have an indirect reporting structure and received an entire letter grade reduction on Scorecard 7.0. This is simple. A dotted line is not enough. There needs to be real reporting to the deputy or the agency head to show that that organization understands the importance of cybersecurity. Agency CIO should report directly to the agency head or deputy, period, end of story. No excuses, and that's why we're bringing those grades down. Today's hearing features IT leaders from the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS is the largest federal civilian agency with an annual operating budget of over $1 trillion. The agency's IT spending exceeded $5 billion per year in fiscal years 2017 and 2018. HHS started at the low end of the FITARA scorecard, earning a D or D- for the last 5 scorecards. And to improve its stagnant grades after Scorecard 5.0 was released, HHS instituted an initiative called A by May to strengthen its implementation of FITARA. Partially as a result of this initiative, the scorecard on the FITARA 7.0 scorecard, HHS has received a B+. I think that's pretty good. It's pretty good, hitting the objective. These improvements by HHS are an example of how the FITARA scorecard positively incentivizes agencies to act. The intent of the scorecard, as my colleagues and original co-author of FITARA, Mr. Connolly, has pointed out, is not to paint agencies with a scarlet letter. Rather, our intent is to incentivize behaviors and actions that result in better managed and more secure IT resources. HHS still has some work to do, as do all federal agencies, and we will get into some of that with GAO's assistance at today's hearing. But there are lessons that can be learned from what y'all have done, what HHS has done, for others to examine and possibly pursue. As has been the case over the last 4 years, I'm proud to be joined at this hearing by my friends and colleagues, Robin Kelly, Mark Meadows, and the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Connolly. I also want to thank GAO for all your work on the FITARA scorecard over the years. You are a force for transparency and accountability, and we cannot do our constitutional task of oversight without them. I know you're not supposed to have favorites, but I think GAO is one of my favorite departments and agencies in the federal government because of what y'all do. Your work is invaluable to the work of this committee, and I want to thank you. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. And now it's a pleasure, as always, to recognize my friend, my partner in crime, the ranking member of the Information Technology Subcommittee, Ms. Robin Kelly, who I have enjoyed working with over these last 4 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's kind of scary to hear you say, in crime, you're ex-CIA, so. But I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Meadows, and Ranking Member Connolly for your leadership as our subcommittee has worked together in a very bipartisan fashion to oversee federal IT systems. It has been a privilege to work with you in this important area, and I've learned a lot from you, so thank you. Data breaches and cybersecurity threats pose a growing threat to the country's largest companies and the federal agencies. Enhancing federal government IT systems is a critical part of our country's national security plan. These joint subcommittee hearings on the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act hold federal agencies accountable for managing IT systems and processes. Our scorecard grades agencies on their implementation of FITARA's requirements. It also provides transparency about what agencies may still need to do. Today, our subcommittee has released the 7th scorecard, as the chairman said, and it shows real overall progress, and it also highlights specific areas that need more attention. As was said, since May, 10 agencies have increased their overall letter grades, 14 are unchanged, and no agencies have fallen in overall score, which is wonderful. Second, 18 agencies received an A grade for their efforts to establish a comprehensive, regularly updated inventory of software licenses. This is more than double the number since the last scorecard. Third, the scorecard identifies an area of concern. 8 agencies received lower scores because their chief information officers still do not report directly to top leadership of the agencies. Agencies must comply with Klinger-Cohen, and those who seek dotted line report structures and unclear flow charts will not receive credit. The reporting structure has a real impact on savings and budgeting for agency IT. GAO has found that CIOs who do not report directly to the heads of their agencies have a weaker ability to manage IT. Last fiscal year, federal agencies spent approximately $81 million on IT investment. Compliance with FITARA is critical to ensuring that agencies can make informed IT investment decisions that result in more modern, efficient, and secure technologies. We continue to preview a new category to grade agencies on their progress to improve their information security programs as required by the Federal Information Security Management Act. Recent data breaches potentially allowed access to millions of customers' information, including 500 million guest records hacked via the Starwood Hotel's reservation database, as announced by Marriott International last week. These cyber attacks highlight the need to strengthen information security in both the government and private sectors. The progress revealed in today's scorecard is evident that bipartisan oversight works and results in more efficient government. I want to thank the witnesses for testifying today. Your background and expertise will be helpful to us in our oversight of federal government IT capabilities and vulnerabilities. Thank you again, Chairman Hurd, and again, I'm happy we had the opportunity to work together because this may be the last time, so thank you.
I'm not dying.
I know you're not dying. I'm not dying either.
We got a lot to do in 116. Now it is an awesome pleasure to recognize the distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, my friend, someone who I've learned a lot from over these last 4 years, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to say thank you for your leadership. As Ms. Kelly just suggested, your gavel may be passed on to Ms. Kelly if she's still on this subcommittee. But I want to just say you get to see a lot of good and a lot of not so good in Congress. And you and Robin's saying, but she's the good. Mr. Chairman, you have been so thoughtful, not only on this, but on IT in general. And I think I speak on behalf of not only Robin and my good friend Jerry Conley. When we work on this particular issue, and I'm saying this for all of you here, this will not end with a passing of a gavel. This is going to continue with the passing of a gavel. And I just want to say thank you for your fine work. Ms. Harris, thank you for continuing to keep us updated on what's happening. We're taking it serious. I think you've seen the questions that we've had in previous hearings and briefings that what is now known as the Conley-ISA bill is producing, you notice that Darrell Issa left before I said that, and it's producing, hopefully, starting to produce the benchmarks that we have to work through. But I also want to stress this, for agencies that are listening today, we're looking at this, we're actually helping other authorizing committees and appropriators start to understand the importance of this. And I know when I brought it up originally with one particular agency, their authorizing group, they said, well, what is FITARA? And now they understand it. And so I'm one that's committed to making sure that the resources are there that actually rewards the fine work that some of you are putting forward. We've made great progress, but I also, my wife was a waitress very early in life when we were just scraping by, and she said, appreciation is green. And I think that what we have to do is make sure that appreciation is green as it relates to agencies as well. And you have my commitment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your upcoming insightful testimony.
Thank you, Chairman. Now it's a pleasure to recognize the half of the authorship team of the Conley-ISA bill that we all affectionately know as FITARA, the distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my your leadership and my colleague, Ms. Kelly, and my friend, Mr. Meadows. The four of us have really tried to operate in a bipartisan way in terms of implementation of FITARA. And we felt that was very important because the last major overhaul, our predecessor bill was known as Clinger-Cohen. And Mr. Cohen became Secretary of Defense shortly after the passage of that bill, and Mr. Clinger retired. And there was no commitment up here to follow through by way of implementation. I hope by now, given our quarterly hearings on the scorecard for FITARA, we have put to rest the idea that we're going to somehow pass a bill and consider our work done. We're not. And I assure you in the new Congress, we will be equally diligent in making sure that implementation is followed through. And again, I don't think we could have done it without the friendship and the cohesion and the cooperation of all four. And I thank Mr. Hurd and Ms. Kelly and Mr. Meadows for their leadership and their cooperative spirit. And honestly, I wish everything on the Hill operated in the kind of bipartisan manner the four of us have with respect to the subject over the last 4 years at least. And I hope that's something we can emulate in the new Congress as well. The scorecard is an important tool for measuring progress, and we look forward to hearing your report and maybe asking some questions about outliers in terms of performance. But I think the scorecard remains something important. And we've said before, the scorecard is not designed to be a scarlet letter on the back of a federal agency. It is designed to be an analytic tool that helps guide areas, highlight areas for improvement, reward areas that, where we seem to have achieved, and to prod for additional progress. And as a tool for the CIO to go back to the secretary and say, we don't want those kinds of grades again. And here's a plan for how we improve. And that's really what the scorecard and what this hearing is designed to do. And it's in that spirit we welcome your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. And I'm taking a point of personal privilege. All this wouldn't have happened over these last 4 years if we didn't have great staff on the for the minority and for the majority. So can y'all join me in thanking those folks for y'all's hard work over 4 years? Good work, y'all. Yeah. Now it is a pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Ms. Carol Harris, Director of IT Management Issues at the Government Accountability Office. I think this is your first time at this subcommittee. Is that testifying?
Not with this subcommittee, but
It's been a while.
the first for FITARA.
FITARA. Well, we're looking forward to many more hearings, you participating in many more hearings on FITARA. And we also have Mr. Ed Simcox, the Chief Technology Officer and Acting Chief Information Officer at the Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you for being here. And Ms. Sheila Connolly, Deputy Chief Financial Officer at the Department of Health and Human Services. Welcome to you all. And pursuant to committee rules, the witnesses will be sworn in before you testify, so please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth? Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please let the record reflect all witnesses answer in the affirmative. And in order to allow time for discussion, please limit your opening remarks to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you is, when the light turns yellow, you have 30 seconds. When it's red, your time is up. And also remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking. Now it's a pleasure to recognize Ms. Harris for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Chairman Hurd, Meadows, Ranking Members Kelly, Connolly, and members of the subcommittee. I would like to thank you and your staff for your continued oversight on IT management with the 7th set of grades. Your persistent and thorough oversight has made a major difference in managing federal IT. Here are some key highlights of major progress. On incremental development, when you held your first scorecard hearing in November 2015, 58% of the federal government software development projects were planning to use a 6-month incremental approach. Now this percentage is up to 88%, and 18 of the 24 agencies receive an A or a B on your scorecard. Regarding data centers, collectively the agencies have closed about 7,300 centers and saved approximately $4.5 billion. With software licensing, the number of A's have more than doubled since last year from 8 to 18, but more importantly is a cost savings associated with this area. This year alone, we expect about $714 million government-wide from consolidating these licenses. That's roughly 7 times the Central Technology Modernization Fund. The total number of agencies who have changed their CIO reporting structure, where they now report to the agency head, has increased to 16. This progress would not have happened to this extent without your scorecard and oversight. The scorecard's methodology has remained the same as 6.0 and previews possible changes to the incremental development and FISMA areas. First, the scorecard continues to preview a cyber grade that is based 50% on an annual IG assessment and 50% on a self-assessment of how agencies stack up against 10 cyber metrics reported quarterly to OMB. These metrics include intrusion detection and authentication associated with high-impact systems. Second, a new method for grading incremental development is under consideration. As you know, the current formula is based on the percentage of software projects delivering functionality every 6 months. The CIO Council has suggested the scope of projects be expanded to include those that are not primarily software development in nature. The vast majority of projects in that bucket are not delivering every 6 months. As a result, the application of the new method would have a negative impact on agencies with more of these projects. However, it would also make the area more comprehensive, as these non-software projects account for about 31% of the total number of IT projects. At the last hearing, we said there would be major improvements to the grades if agencies simply did 3 things. Number 1, report to the agency head. Number 2, establish a working capital fund to reinvest savings. And number 3, have a complete software license inventory. Well, the agencies responded, and so far, most have made significant progress on the third. As a result, we saw 11 agency grades go up, including HHS. 13 did not change, and none went down. Right now, the grades are 10 Bs, 8 Cs, 6 Ds, and no Fs. If each agency did these 3 things again, report to the agency head, establish a working capital fund, and have a complete software license inventory, the grades would be 5 As, 15 Bs, 4 Cs, and not a single D or F. These 3 actions and associated higher grades are achievable by the next scorecard. Now turning to the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS plans to spend almost $6 billion on IT this year. 80% of this is for operational systems. HHS received a D grade on the first 5 scorecards, a C on the 6th, and a B on the current 7th. HHS's current acting CIO reports directly to the Secretary, but this reporting structure has not been established in policy. Solidifying this reporting is important since the average CIO tenure at HHS is 2 years. They have had 8 CIOs since 2004 and 4 since 2012. Some positive areas. 97% of their software development projects use an incremental approach. Their portfolio stat savings of $4.4 billion is the highest among the 24 agencies, and they receive an A in the software license area. Their progress to meet data center optimization metrics, however, is rather low and is the main reason for the low grade in this area. Regarding the cybersecurity area, their IG assessment is a 2 out of 5 in each of the 5 NIST framework areas, and they self-report meeting 4 of the 10 OMB cyber metrics. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my comments on the overall scorecard and the results for HHS.
Thank you for your remarks, and thank you for your help in making this happen. Now, Mr. Simcox, you're recognized, and I believe you're providing the opening remarks for HHS.
Good morning, Chairman Hurd, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Members Connolly and Kelly, and distinguished members of both subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee about my department's implementation of the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act. My name is Ed Simcox, and I am the Chief Technology Officer and Acting Chief Information Officer at the Department of Health and Human Services. Information technology plays a vital role across government, enabling mission, fostering efficient operations, and promoting data, transparency, and allowing cross-agency collaboration. At HHS, FITARA has provided an excellent framework by which we manage our $6.1 billion IT spend, measure success, and collaborate across our federated environment. It has fostered a governance structure at HHS that drives strategic investments across our 10 operating divisions. As we celebrate the 4th anniversary of FITARA's passage, I want to thank the committee for laying this valuable groundwork, which has enabled broad engagement across our department. Our rapid improvement from the FITARA 4.0, where we received a D-, to today's FITARA 7.0, where we have a B+, would not have been possible without broad collaboration. Working in partnership with GAO, OMB, and Hill staff has been critical. This committee's advice has directly contributed to the IT improvements at HHS. And on behalf of our team, thank you for your counsel, your feedback, and your support during this process. HHS galvanized our federated IT community and department-wide policy officials through our FITARA Scorecard initiative called A by May. This initiative is underpinned by 3 core components: data, dialogue, and delivering results. We call this methodology D3, and it has established a common language at HHS where we can effectively compare performance across our operating divisions. Internal data reporting has empowered the department to rapidly increase investment in high-risk, mission-critical IT initiatives. Through dialogue, HHS expanded understanding of FITARA from an IT law to a law designed to support mission delivery through the effective use of technology. And in delivering real change, HHS has developed its first enterprise-wide software license inventory, which consists of over 4 million licenses across 12,000 software publishers. We fully support the spirit and intent of the MGT Act. We believe it is vital for modernizing HHS information technology. We believe that HHS's non-recurring expense fund provides HHS the ability to meet the goals of the MGT Act's IT Working Capital Fund under current law. IT projects funded through our non-recurring expense fund include critical updates to cybersecurity, cloud migration, Medicare appeals automation, and modernizing IT systems at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. As the lead department responsible for healthcare and public health in the United States, HHS understands and respects the importance of protecting critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. We recognize cybersecurity must be embedded in everything that we do at HHS, in our DNA, if you will, not just a separate focus. We recognize that a robust department-wide, risk management-driven cybersecurity framework is needed to address scorecard metrics and is needed to reduce our exposure. The truth lies in the data. We achieved high scores by following instructions and using data to drive conversation, collaboration, and change. FITARA was signed into law almost 4 years ago, and I can say that it has created a culture shift within HHS. At HHS, we like to say FITARA is both a law and a lifestyle. We appreciate our collaboration with the committee and the staff and acknowledge FITARA's impact as a driver for improvement. I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Simcox. I hope all of our friends that are reporting on this got that line. You know, FITARA is a law and a lifestyle. I like that. Now we're going to go to probably one of the few people in Congress that actually has real life experience with these types of issues. The gentleman from Montana, Mr. Gianforte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to start by thanking you for your leadership for this committee. I think this is the oversight that this committee has shown through FITARA has been a real bright spot in terms of affecting change in the agencies, and I just thank you for your leadership in that regard. Mr. Simcox, thank you for embracing FITARA and leading at HHS to drive the changes, and congratulations on the improvement in your grade. I know how much work organizational transformation requires, so congratulations to you. And I know as living this new lifestyle, I'm sure you'll continue to improve as well. I want to focus on incremental development. That's a real bright spot at HHS. It's part of the scorecard. We went through a similar transition in our own private sector business. We had hundreds of people in our software engineering organization. We had used to use a big bang waterfall approach. We shifted from content-based releases to more of a cargo ship, date-oriented releases, and we saw great results. We went from annual releases of software to quarterly releases of software, and we were driving towards monthly releases of software. And the result was huge. We had higher quality. We were able to be more responsive to our customers, and it was all done at a lower cost. So clearly you're enjoying some of those same benefits from adopting this. And I wanted to start, if I could, with Ms. Harris. Could you talk from GAO's perspective about how HHS compares to other agencies in terms of adoption of the incremental development methodology?
HHS is one of the leaders in adopting incremental development on their software development projects. So they're one of the best as compared to the rest of the federal government. And this is, compliments to Mr. Simcox and his predecessor, Beth Killeran, as well, for instituting that greater adoption to break up these monolithic projects into these smaller, more manageable chunks, because that's what we want to see, and that's where we avoid those disastrous, big bang type major IT initiatives that ultimately fail.
Yeah, can you explain a little bit about the potential revised grading methodology for this metric that you're currently investigating?
Sure. So the CIO Council has proposed changing the methodology to expand the scope of projects that are considered, and they're proposing to expand it to all IT projects, not just software development projects. So that could be projects that have a large IT component to it, but not necessarily considered an IT project or hardware, for example. And so by increasing the scope of projects, thereby it would be a more comprehensive look into to what extent agencies are producing functionality every 6 months, more than just software development, but all IT projects in general. So that emphasis of going incremental would apply across all IT projects. So that was a suggestion by the CIO Council, which we think is a good one to consider.
Okay. Mr. Simcox, can you talk about HHS policy as it relates to incremental development, and how do you consider that as you look at projects?
Thank you. Yes, incremental development is one of the things that we look at across all of our major IT investments as things are flowing through the approval process. And again, the FITARA has, we've institutionalized FITARA into what we do at HHS so that when we are looking at projects, we're vetting projects, one of the things we look very closely at is what is the development life cycle? Is it really agile? Are we able to deliver in chunks? Are we able to get to a minimally viable product quickly and iterate through a project rather than taking that waterfall cascading approach?
Yeah. One of the things we found as we adopted this model was automated testing became very critical because the cycles, as you shorten them up, testing consumes a larger and larger portion. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of automated testing and if there's any suggestions for us for enhancing FITARA to incorporate some of those best practices?
Sure. I'm just getting read in on the automation that we have going on within our testing methodologies, but I can tell you that it is super critical, especially as we tighten or shorten up those cycles. There are many things that are repetitive tasks that are involved with testing that can be handled through robotic process automation and things of that nature, especially in a componentized type architecture.
Yeah, we found that, with 15 or 20,000 test points, manual testing takes months, yet with shorter cycles, we ended up moving to the point where we could do all of the regression overnight through automation, and it was the only way to get the full benefit out of this incremental development. So I would just encourage, as we look at these areas and adoption of incremental development, what additional best practices should be adopted around this automated testing to get the full benefit. And I thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ranking Member Kelly, round one.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Harris, you have laid out very nicely what the agencies need to do to improve their scores. You've made it very simple. In which category do you think there has been the most improvement and is the easiest for people to do?
Well, I think for 7.0, this has definitely been the strongest showing by far for the agencies. For the first time ever, there have been no Fs, and I think that's tremendous. And I again applaud the work that you've done in your oversight efforts to push the agencies here. Software licenses is by far the area where agencies have made the most progress, especially compared to the last scorecard 6.0. And that, I think, has been because of the focus on making it a priority, having these centralized software license inventories that are regularly updated. Again, that I think because of the emphasis from you all, that's one of the most improved categories. And at the same time, there are also categories where agencies struggle as well. And I would say that those two areas would be MGT, and then also in terms of data center consolidation and optimization, while I think the agencies are doing pretty well in achieving their savings goals. Optimization is an area where there's still a large area of improvement that's needed.
And why do you think they're struggling in those areas?
I think a large part of that is leadership commitment and a focus, making it a priority at the agencies.
And what do you feel that Congress can do or we can do to help move them along?
I think continuing with these hearings is essential, and issuing the scorecard will keep them on their toes, because I think that will incentivize them and drive their behavior and make these areas a focus.
Okay. And we've talked about HHS today and what you guys have done. So, Mr. Simcox, what steps and priority changes did HHS take to achieve A grades in portfolio review and software licensing? What was the secret sauce?
I think the secret sauce was our ability to institutionalize the FITARA framework inside of HHS and instill it in the culture at HHS to and change the DNA, not only within our IT staff and our federated IT staff across our operating divisions, but also in our leadership. Getting a common dialogue and a common set of terminology that's understood. That was very essential to getting to the point where we were able to then turn the corner and capture all of our software license data across our federated environment.
It almost sounds like a cultural shift.
It really has been.
And what other IT management changes do you have planned to maintain and improve your scorecard?
We continue to look at all of the different scoring metrics and look for opportunities to take that model of data, dialogue, and delivery and apply it systematically across the current scoring metrics, as well as things that we fully expect you will add to the scoring process.
And what do you see as your challenges or barriers to improvement?
I would say that we are a very heavily federated environment, and I'm happy to say that we've made great progress in pulling together and coalescing our operating divisions around the vision for FITARA. There's a constant cycle of outreach that has to go on. So as we add new things to the scorecard, or we want to improve grades where we don't have an A, we have to continue that constant cycle of dialogue. It's a positive and proactive thing that we need to do, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort.
And just because I'm always interested in this, as far as your workforce and people that you have, are you finding people for your positions that you need in IT, or do you struggle with that?
I think across federal government, we struggle somewhat to match up to industry, if you will, as far as recruitment is concerned. I think that we're taking a lot of steps in the right direction in that area. I think the CIO Council, for instance, is putting a lot of thought into a four-pronged approach to attracting people to federal service, who are in IT. We spend a lot of time looking into things like alternative hiring authorities and other means by which we can get creative around attracting talent to come into federal service in IT.
Thank you, and I yield.
I'll take 5 minutes right here. Mr. Simcox, the non-recurring expense fund, do you have sole control over that fund as the acting CIO?
The CFO and I actually approve the overall IT budget through our annual IT budget review process.
So you can make a decision exclusively by yourself by using funds in the non-recurring expense fund.
Can you repeat the question?
In the non-recurring expense fund, can you make a decision how that money is spent, you alone?
Actually, the secretary is ultimately responsible statutorily for deciding how much funding to allocate to each project within the non-recurring expense fund.
Is the money in the non-recurring expense fund used for things other than IT modernization?
Yes, sir. 1/3 of that money is used for facilities, capital projects regarding facilities. 2/3 of it is used for IT across the 5 years of the fund.
For the upcoming fiscal year, how much of that non-reoccurring expense fund, dollar amount, percentage of, is being used for modernization efforts through your digital infrastructure?
I am not sure on that fact. I'd have to get back with you on that.
Here's my problem with this, right? And Ms. Conley, we had asked for y'all's general counsel or some legal representative to come here and answer some of these questions, and we were informed that y'all would be prepared to answer all my questions about the legal decision on why you think creating an MGT working capital fund is unnecessary. And my question is, what legal analysis was undertaken at HHS to say that you do not have the authority to transfer money into the MGT working capital fund?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your question, and thank you for the opportunity to be back here today. I was here in June of 2017 when we had the D- score for HHS, and to echo a lot of the comments that have been made thus far, the work of the committee, GAO, and others to keep the pressure on agencies is working. We got the message, and hopefully you're seeing the results of your interest in our action as a result. As it relates to the MGT, right, as Mr. Simcox mentioned earlier, we have this non-recurring expense fund. This has been written into our appropriations. It's been
Do
in
you know
effect.
how much of that fund is going to be used for IT modernization efforts for this upcoming fiscal year?
What I can tell you is that to date, from 2013 through 18, over $2 billion of that fund has been used for IT modernization efforts, including cybersecurity.
Can the CIO make decisions on how that fund's being used, or does somebody else have to offer the approval?
All of the proposals for use of that fund go through the CIO's office, and the CIO needs to approve those proposals.
But
as
somebody can
well as-
overrule how the decision the CIO has.
As Mr. Simcox mentioned earlier, the secretary ultimately is responsible because the fund can be used for two purposes, for capital investments into facilities as well as IT.
Gotcha. So what legal analysis went into making the conclusion that HHS lacks the authority lacks the transfer authority to move money into the MGT account?
Right. So as it relates to our transfer authority, we have very specific transfer authority that's provided in several instances,
And
of
that's
which
why
one
we
is
wrote,
the,
that's why we wrote and passed the MGT Act.
Yes.
To give the authority for the CIO to have access to a working capital fund that is exclusively used by the CIO.
Yes.
And it is frustrating that the agencies claim that that you lack the transfer authority when we just passed legislation to do that. So the question is,
Yes.
and again, this is why we wanted your general counsel here to answer these questions, is what legal analysis went into deciding that you do not have, that CIO does not have the transfer authority to move money that they save in a fiscal year into a MGT working capital fund?
So we have the authority to create an MGT working capital fund, IT working capital fund, but we do not, we have to be provided explicit transfer authority.
And so a law from Congress that says this is something that a federal CIO should have access to is not enough authority?
Well, sir, if in the GAO's Red Book or the Federal Appropriations Law Book, they point out that agencies may transfer funds only when expressly authorized by law.
And when was that last updated?
It was fairly, this is a quote from the most recent version
And
of
when
the
was
Red
that?
Book.
When was
I
that?
don't have the exact date, sir, but I can get that for
I'm
you.
of the opinion that I think that is probably written and approved prior to the passage of the most recent law of the MGT Act. So should I take your comments to say no legal opinion, nothing was put into making this legal decision? Like, what steps were actually undertaken? What analysis? Who did the analysis? Why did they come to that final conclusion?
Well,
And it was just reading the Red Book?
reading the Red Book and in practice, and reading our appropriation law, our appropriation bills, and looking for those authorities. And
Did y'all read the MGT bill that was passed?
yes, sir, we did, as well as the OMB implementation guidance, and specifically the OMB implementation guidance subsequent to the issuance of the law indicates that it doesn't confer transfer authority.
So it is y'all's
to
opinion that
agencies.
Congress decided to create a working capital fund that the CIO had access to, but we did not think that the CIO should be able to transfer money into it? That's the final analysis?
What I would suggest is, if it would be helpful, we could come back and meet with you.
That's why we asked your lawyers to come here, so we can have this conversation here.
Yes, and we would be happy to put something in writing from our lawyers or come back to meet with you at the staff level or at your levels.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Ms. Harris, do you think it was congressional intent to create a working capital fund and then not give the CIO the ability to transfer money into it?
No, I did not.
Thank you. The gentleman, the distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly echo the sentiments of the chairman with respect to clear congressional intent with respect to MGT. And we're going to have to have those conversations with your attorneys. It's a missed opportunity not to have them here today. Let me also say, maybe on a discordant note, it's a missed opportunity not to have the Department of Justice here today. We had an organizing meeting about this hearing Thursday. We were going to have two agencies, one that's been making progress, one that's kind of been sliding a little bit over the last 2 years, and that latter is not here. And I certainly don't want to believe the theories that have gone on, that there was some other agenda that drove why the Department of Justice suddenly disappeared from this hearing. I want to believe that, I don't know, we decided we only needed to hear from one agency. But I want to express my disappointment, and I want to express my strong view that if we're not going to hear from the Department of Justice today, we most certainly will hear from them early in the new year, in the new Congress. I want to hear their testimony about what they're doing to implement FITARA. And I really regret the decision, without consultation, to drop Department of Justice from today's hearing. Having said that, I want to pick up on Ms. Kelly's line of questioning about data center consolidation, Ms. Harris. Because if you go back to the report in August, GAO stated 6 agencies reported they did not plan to meet their goals for closing tiered data centers, and 9 reported they didn't plan to meet their goals for closing non-tiered data centers for the end of the fiscal year of 2018. Has anything changed since that August report?
No, none has changed.
So that doesn't sound like robust progress to me. And when Mr. Issa, and I welcome Mr. Issa to the hearing, when Mr. Issa wrote this bill, we have a pretty strong, explicit chapter on data center consolidation. And it was built actually on a bipartisan basis on Vivek Kundra, his recommendations, his 25 recommendations, one of which was to cut in half the number of data centers. And we cut it in half again. Now, we didn't know that the federal government actually was wildly off on how many data, the only progress we made at one point was to actually learn we had many more than we thought. So we went from 1,600 data centers to 12,000. So I'm glad we're getting better at identifying them, but golly gosh darn, the goal here in the law is to consolidate them, move to the cloud, and effectuate savings. The GAO report does say we've done a pretty good job of some of that savings, $4.5 billion. But if the other part about agencies not making their progress and meeting their goals is true, that's savings left on the table. And it's also inefficiency not addressed. So what are we going to do you gave an otherwise fairly rosy report, and I accept that, but I don't want to somehow sweep this part of FITARA under the carpet, because I think this is where savings can be effectuated that then can be used through MGT, once we settle the legal issues, to reinvest in the enterprise.
Absolutely. Sir, when you look at the scorecard and you look at the individual area for data center consolidation, there's still a handful of Fs there, so it does, obviously that means that there's still quite a bit of progress that agencies can make to focus on consolidating and closing data centers. So there's absolutely, you're right, there's money that's left on the table if agencies sweep this under the rug and don't make this a priority focus.
How you doing, Mr. Simcox, on this subject? Since you're the only one here,
Thank,
that is to say HHS. No, you're here, Ms. Conley. And by the way, you need to learn how to spell the name. But all right, that's a different subject.
More streamlined.
that's been a source of confusion for me over the last few days. We have, out of 54 data centers, we've made progress in closing 17 as far as tiered data centers are concerned. So, we have 37, left. And I can tell you that we can do better, and we'll continue to make progress on that. I would also like to mention our enthusiastic support for shifting from a cloud-first type approach to a cloud-smart type approach, where we're able to actually look at the subject matter that's in the systems and really match that to the mission that is supported by these systems, as well as any legislative requirements as to do we need to sequester a particular system? Do we need to cordon it off? Does it need to be in an enclave? Can it move to the cloud? And then finally, geographically, geographical limitations as to where a system might need to sit. For instance, in Indian Health Service, a portion of the systems we've yet to close, we have to deal with geographical limitations where we have very, very limited connectivity, and we're holding healthcare records and other sensitive data at point of care, if you will, and we have to use a store and forward method of getting that data out of that data center into a centralized repository. So there are certain data centers where it's going to be difficult for us to completely close them.
Well, if the chair would allow, I mean, both Mr. Issa and I, in writing the bill, did not take a rigid juridical approach. We didn't do that on CIOs, for example. We didn't say by fiat there shall only be one CIO. We allowed the culture to evolve, but we want it to evolve. And likewise in data centers, although in data centers we did actually put in metrics predicated on what we thought we all understood through OMB data. We don't want a mindless, rigid approach. If a data center makes sense, it makes sense. Perhaps the one you gave in terms of Native American health services makes sense. But we also don't want it to be simply neglected, as it most certainly was at the time we wrote the bill. We want to create pressure, so that the default is defend while you got it, as opposed to I don't need to do anything, and we'll merrily move on. Ms. Harris, one final question, if I may. In our pre-hearing briefing, there was discussion, and I see the gentleman behind you, I think, helped bring this up, that there might be some sort of methodology change in how we look at data centers within the federal agencies that could further cloud our ability to compare apples and oranges. And that was of concern to us, that we don't want to use that as subterfuge for avoiding the goal. And so maybe as my last question, Mr. Chairman, you could elaborate on that and how you propose we approach it.
So OMB is currently considering revising their metrics. They have a draft proposal that I believe is open for comment till the end of this month. As part of their revised metrics, one of the concerns that we have is that they are moving away from being able to measure being able to measure progress in consolidating data centers, as well as measuring the optimization of these centers. And I'll give you an example. When you take a look at server utilization, that's that is currently being reported as a percentage, which gives an idea of the degree to which the servers are being utilized. With OMB's proposed change, what they're looking to do is move to report only the number of underutilized servers in each data center. So without that context of the total number of centers, or of servers, you lose that ability to know the progress being made in consolidating those servers. So that's one example of a metric where OMB could potentially be fuzzing things up.
The gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, all of you for your testimony. So Ms. Harris, who has expressed their concern to OMB about changing that matrix?
Well, that's something that we are currently looking at, and we do intend to meet with OMB to talk about our concerns with the proposed changes.
And to date, what is their rationale for changing it? Is it not working the way it is?
We're still in the process of scheduling that meeting, and so
No, I get that. So is it working the way it is right now, the matrix?
we see, I mean, it's not perfect, but we do think that the current metrics that are in place are giving a pretty good picture of how the agencies are doing relative to their goals.
So who at OMB is initiating this restructure? I mean, who's the person in charge? Where does the buck stop?
I would imagine the federal CIO.
Okay. And so did they reach out to anybody at GAO to understand? I mean, what did they wake up one morning and say, oh my gosh, let's change the matrix? I mean, why are they doing that?
Well, I do think that they probably had multiple conversations with the CIO Council and probably the agencies themselves, and they probably. I
So
can't.
the
I can't
agencies
speak
would,
for OMB.
do you think
but
the agencies would prefer the matrix to be changed?
that I can't answer that question. I'm not sure whether or not they would prefer that. I just know that we have some concerns about the new proposed metrics because it could potentially be fuzzing up the waters.
Okay. Mr. Simcock, would you have a problem with the matrix being changed on servers? Be careful how you answer with Mr. Conley spelled correctly down to my right.
No,
Okay.
I don't believe so.
Okay. I guess where I would go with this, Ms. Harris, if you and your colleague would reach out to OMB and just tell them that is of significant concern. It's like changing the parameters for an SAT test. If you change it and it's a different standard for high school students today versus high school students 20 years ago, you can make the scores anything they want to be, and I'm concerned. If you're only looking at underutilized servers and only that matrix, then you have no idea on how much stuff that you've moved to the cloud or not. I mean, because at that point, if you're truly looking at server capacity, at these data centers, it doesn't show the whole picture. Now, I can make the argument that, okay, that's great if we've got this many underserved, underutilized servers that you could consolidate here. But I'm concerned about changing it. And it's just like with Ms. Conley and Mr. Simcock coming in today. I want to thank you both for taking the previous hearing. And Ms. Conley, I think you were there and taking the pain of the previous hearing and actually adapting it in your culture. It's far too often, people come to committees like this and all they do is get beat up. And we're in the beating up business. I get that. But I would like to acknowledge just the tremendous work. And I think you're a model for a lot of other people to follow. So will you pass that to your entire IT team? And for your general counsel who has gotten it wrong, listen, your general counsel can't make that assumption and be different than every other, well, it's not every other agency. There's agencies that are going both ways. I can tell you the intent of Congress was not ambiguous. And with that, it is critically important that we, if we're only going to allow the appropriators to make the authorization, then this law, setting this aside, had no effect. And it'll have no effect ever, because every year you go through an appropriation season that, quite frankly, requires you to go back to your appropriators and beg for transfer, and that's not the intent of Mr. Connolly's gone, the ISA Connolly bill, and so it's just it was not the intent. And so if you will take it back to your general counsel and tell him that we're going to look at this a lot more in detail, and I don't want this hearing to be all focused on what your general counsel did or did not do, because that would undermine the good work that you've done. But I can tell you, we want to empower Mr. Simcock to be able to do what he needs to do without having Secretary Azar have to sign off on it. And it's pure and simple. That's what this was all about. And if you ask Secretary Azar, I guarantee he does not have any knowledge of how to keep out cyber attacks any more than I do. And yet we want to put the funds and the resources there. I'm willing to commit extra dollars. Yes, a conservative member of Congress willing to commit extra dollars to make sure that you're properly rewarded, but I'm only going to do that if you follow the intent of what Mr. Ice and Mr. Connolly originally proposed, and the majority of the members voting for it. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Concerns? Don't play poker, Ms. Connolly. What's your concern?
Well, if I might just add to what you've said, and we'll take the follow-up action to be very clear, but I do want to just make the point that as an organization and enterprise, we're lockstep in the objectives of the MGT Act, and through the NEF to date, we've been able to accomplish a lot of IT modernization and fund cybersecurity that frankly up until now is very difficult to fund in annual appropriations. And so it's provided a mechanism for us to provide these capital investments. But again, as I said, so I think lockstep in spirit and intent, and we're accomplishing things, but not, we do need to work this out. So we'll take the follow-up action.
Yeah,
as you
so,
said.
so it's more than a follow-up.
Yes.
So we want you to report back to this committee on how you're going to fix it.
Yes, sir.
Because I can tell you that once a GC makes an opinion, it goes in the file. So when the intent of all of you are gone, you've gone on to some other profession making better money than you're making now, and that sits there in the file, there's another GC that comes along and says, well, the previous person said that. I want to make sure that we address this while it is current, and that we actually get the intent of Congress to be followed. And so that's why I need your general counsel to follow back up. Deal? I yield back.
My friend from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, is recognized now for her first 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing, and am fascinated by this so-called working capital fund, because it's fairly unusual in our system for agencies to be able to disconnect themselves from the appropriators and have the authority to replace existing systems, and even, it would appear, to enhance cybersecurity without getting some express authorization for it. I was intrigued, therefore, that with this gift horse that the agency seemed to have been given, there was reluctance. Indeed, some agencies do not believe they have the authority to move or to use the language of that I thought would not obtain here, reprogram appropriated monies into these so-called working capital funds. The whole point was to keep these things current and to not keep coming back to Congress and saying, may I please, 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 and by the way, it's already passed us. So my first question really has to go to, goes to Ms. Harris. Why are our agencies expressing concern, or worse, just not implementing these capital funds when they seem to have the authority, unless you think they don't have the authority?
I appreciate the question. I think, as Mr. Simcox said, FITARA is a lifestyle. It's really part of the culture, and I think cultural change is really difficult. And so I think, in large part, one of the reasons why agencies are not quick to embrace this MGT is a cultural issue versus a legal one.
Well, then, of course, we're in defiance of the whole point. The whole point is to keep these systems current, indeed, to allow enhancement of cybersecurity. And I can understand the old-fashioned way of doing things, but it is very disappointing. Ms. Harris, do you think, let's ask you in GAO's legal opinion, do they have the authority to establish and move money into these working capital funds?
Ma'am, I'm not the best expert within GAO to answer that question because I'm not a lawyer. So that's a question that I'd have to take for the record.
It's a question not only you should take for the record, it's a question, it seems to me, that needs to be clarified for agencies. If the point was to make sure we don't get behind, and they're working under the old may I please system, then we are going to get behind. So I am very concerned that agencies which usually relish freedom are not taking advantage of this. So I would ask you to report back to the committee a legal opinion as to whether or not the agencies have the authority to use these working capital funds to replace their existing systems and even to upgrade cybersecurity without going through the usual process. And some of them are accustomed to reprogramming and the like. And then you have to go to the appropriators to get the authority to reprogram. So I would ask for you to submit to the chairman, because then it seems to me we could clarify this and free agencies to do what they need to do. Mr. Simcox, you didn't respond to the, or perhaps at least not by the deadline, on the status of HHS MGT efforts.
Thank you. So we apologize for that. Actually, we did sign off on that memo internally. We apologize that it did not reach you in time.
Okay. So could you tell us what the status is?
I'll take that question if I may.
Yes, please.
Yes, the status is, as we talked about earlier, we could create a working capital fund under the MGT Act, but we don't have the authority to transfer funds from appropriated accounts into non-appropriated
Well,
accounts.
that's exactly what I'm asking.
Yeah.
A legal
Now,
opinion about.
And
because
some agencies do have that authority. I don't think that's
you
a
think it
problem.
needs to be specifically given? And that
That's-
Congress would actually give it to some agencies and not others?
That's, in our case, we do not believe so, based on our experience, but as we've talked about, we will work with our general counsel and come back to the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank my friend from the District of Columbia for succinctly and accurately depicting how we intended to use the MGT fund. This is something I'm looking forward to working with everybody on. Now, last but not least, though maybe we did save the best for last, the distinguished gentleman from California, one of the lead architects of the ISA Connolly bill, Mr. Darrell Issa from California.
Thank you, and I'll be gone next year, and it will be the Conley ISA bill. So it will morph. But he's assured me I'll still be one of the names somewhere there, like a law firm where the founding partner is the 9th down because he's been dead a while. But in all seriousness, and this is serious, Congressman Connolly and I worked on what became obviously FITARA, but it also is in fact 2 pieces of legislation. One is about moving to the cloud, moving to efficiencies, and quite frankly, the safety that comes with larger, better run sites. So I want to start by following up where Mr. Connolly left off in a couple of areas. Mr. Simcox, could you provide to the committee on each of those remaining sites, those which have a technical difficulty in consolidation? For example, available bandwidth, therefore, if you remoted it, you would have a difficult time downloading and uploading. In the case of those sites, I would think the committee would be well served if you would also include whether or not telework was allowed at those sites, because I want to fully understand the available bandwidth in the area, but also how much of it's already being used to offboard from a site. Similarly, on those sites which you named sensitivity, would you provide for the committee information as to whether or not there is secure VPN or non-secure VPN access to those sites? Because we often hear that a site has a sensitivity, and we hear about and see the sensitivity information. We then see that there are accesses to it that say, you know what, it's just as safe anywhere in the globe based on the accesses, the ports that are being opened for that. And so I think that's sort of, and I'm not claiming that we're technically your peer, but I think providing that information in clear language for what you believe the justification is would allow in the future the committee, when they're looking at a scoreboard, to say there are X amount of tough nuts. These tough nuts do not get you from an A to a B or a C. They, in fact, are waived as long as those problems exist and therefore consolidation is inappropriate. And I'd love to be able to say that the exceptions you talked about today are in fact set aside for as long as those exceptions are clearly justified. Because I think where we find disagreement, and one of them was the utilization. Utilization sounds like a great way to say, well, that site is fully utilized. To be candid, 4 fully utilized sites with sufficient bandwidth moved to a single cloud still gains huge efficiencies. Efficiencies in, as you know, peak load, efficiencies in the ongoing maintenance. And the thing that Mr. Connolly and I are most concerned about is many of those legacy sites you have are maintained by government or contract employees who do the best they can, but they're updating a little bit like the House of Representatives. They're updating on a weekly or monthly basis. They're even going to Microsoft, if you're the House of Representatives, and asking for an extension to the obsolescence of an operating system because they're that far behind. When you're with IBM or Amazon or any of the other global cloud providers, you're getting updated on a moment-by-moment basis. And so I'd like you to comment particularly on, for a moment, those sites that you have that might be considered fully utilized but are not being managed at the same level as the best contracts would be in current cloud performances. And I'm not naming a company, but rather that group that provide that kind of work.
Thank you for the question. We do have tiered data centers that are pretty fully occupied, at capacity, if you will. But at the same time, as you suggested, it's not necessarily an inherent core competency of the federal government to run high-tech data centers. There are companies that are very, very good at this. They leverage economies of scale associated with doing that work. And they offer what I think is extremely important, and that is elasticity, so that you can, so the amount of compute power and storage and things that you need to run the business of government are available on demand. So we, one of the things that we're doing actually actively right now is using this FITARA framework to go back out and do a set of data calls around these data centers to look at some more low-hanging fruit, some opportunities for us to address this very thing. Because as you said, just because we have a data center at full capacity doesn't necessarily mean we should still be in the business of running data centers in the federal government.
Thank you, and I'm going to close with a statement for the chairman, but a question to take back for you. My reading of the disparity between one agency's belief that under this piece of legislation you do or don't have authority to move funds, I would say that this may be an example, and I'm going to ask it as a question to you. If the President were to issue an executive order clarifying his interpretation of this law and that it applies to all agencies of the federal government, would you then have clear authority subject to his interpretation that the law we passed had a clear intent and therefore it preempts questions of whether you have specific authorization? And again, my question is, if you received a single order from the Office of Management and Budget, so to speak, saying that that was their interpretation, would that clarify your problem?
I really am not in a position to provide a legal interpretation. I think it would be helpful, I mean, for us to take that back and look at it.
If you had to pick whether to piss off the President, okay, or some legal counsel, which would you choose? May be a better question.
Well, maybe I could rephrase the question to the point where what we're all about is modernizing, securing, making sure we have secure, reliable, and available systems to carry out our programs and carry out our mission.
I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman.
How we do that, I think, is the key.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that it may be appropriate for this committee, and probably on a bipartisan basis, to send a request to the Office of Management and Budget explaining that we've learned this problem of interpretation and that I think Congress's action was clear. We expected it would be uniformly implemented, and it may be one of those times when we can get broad support for an interpretation of the law that would clarify it for all agencies. And as one member of Congress departing, that would not be an affront to the appropriators, since sometimes they have to play in this and sometimes they don't, but rather a recognition that this fund is only useful if, in fact, it can be used seamlessly.
I appreciate that, Chairman, and I would agree that many of the original co-sponsors on the MGT Act were appropriators, so I would say that their intent was very clear. And, you know, the reason that we have broadened the number of folks that participate in these meetings is because the first set of conversations we realize the CIO is not the problem. You know, we need to make sure that we're giving the CIO all the authorities they need in order to hold them accountable. That's why we broaden it out for CFOs. That's why we broaden it out to deputy agency heads, because many of the problems that we have are not with the CIO shop or what's happening within the IT department. It's other parts of the agencies that's getting in the way of letting the CIO do their jobs. That's why we have expanded these issues. That's why I think it's important for the reporting structure of the CIO to be at the deputy or the agency head. And with that, Mr. Simcox, when were you named acting CIO?
Approximately 3.5 months ago.
And you are currently performing both CIO and CTO duties?
Yes, sir.
In your role as CTO, who do you report to?
I report to the Secretary.
In your role as acting CIO, who do you report to?
I report to the Secretary.
So when you find a permanent CIO, who is that person going to report to?
I understand how important this question is. I understand why it's important, sir, and how important it is to FITARA.
And I also know that this isn't your decision, right? So my question is your understanding of when a permanent CIO gets named, who will that person be reporting to?
I can tell you that HHS fully intends to be compliant with the spirit and the letter of the law.
And why can you tell me that?
We are undergoing deliberations right now to that effect.
So that means there's a plan being put in place to change the reporting structure.
I can't speak on specifics. We have an open rec on USA Jobs for the CIO position, and unfortunately, because of certain rules and regulations we have to follow during that process, I'm not at liberty to talk about that.
Good copy on that. Do you agree that the CIO should report to the secretary or the deputy secretary?
I can tell you that we fully intend on complying with the law, this both by spirit and letter, and we are looking into this matter. I can tell you that it's important for the CIO to have the authorities and abide by the law.
Ms. Harris, why is it so hard for these remaining 8 agencies to change their reporting structure? Why do they think that a dashed line, I know this is kind of a hypothetical question, what is the difficulty there?
I think organizations are I think they're very resistant to change. I think that's the primary issue. It's cultural resistance.
And that's why Congress is here to beat them over the heads, right? And we're going to continue to do that. And Mr. Simcox, in addition to HHS responding to this committee on their insights on why y'all can't give the CIO the authority to transfer money into an MGT, I would like a response on what the formal plans are in elevating the CIO to report directly to the agency head or the deputy agency head. Megabyte. Y'all pulled it off, right? Well done, implementation there. What would you say to people that say it's hard to figure out all the licenses you have operating on your network?
It shouldn't be hard.
Why was it not hard for y'all?
I think the reason it was not hard for us is because of FITARA. FITARA gave us a platform by which we could change culture and we could create a cadence of reporting throughout our federated environment that allowed us access to the networks and allowed us access to systems to be able to take a full inventory of our software.
Do you have an idea of how much money y'all saved by going through this process?
I haven't been read in on that specific fact, but I'm happy to get back with you.
Ms. Harris, you said it was for $714 million just over this year?
That is correct, government-wide in consolidating licensees.
That's why we do this. I guess my final question, Ms. Conley, how much money is going to be transferred from savings that the IT department of HHS has saved? How much is that is going to be transferred into the non-recurring expense fund?
So the way in which the non-recurring expenses fund is funded is through expired funds in our discretionary accounts. Right. And so that's how that is financed.
Which further proves the point. The whole reason of MGT was the savings that he uses from making sure they have all of their licenses in place, making sure they're closing down some data centers, is then transferred into a fund that she, whoever the replacement may be, can have access to that for further modernization. Right? That was the reason for the construction of this fund. And what drives me nuts is that there's other people within the organization that is preventing that from happening when it was very clear from this body. Look, it's Washington, D.C. in 2018. Nothing bipartisan happens. This is one of those things where there's bipartisan outrage. There was bipartisan work on this. The fact that authorizers and appropriators were able to work together to pull this off. And then some bureaucrat is getting in the way from implementing something that's going to make sure that he's protecting all the information for everybody that has Medicare, Medicaid, in order to protect the American citizens' information. That's just, it's nuts. So get back to us. We're going to be here next week. So you have until Wednesday. Get back to us on Wednesday with an answer on this MGT fund. Mr. Simcox, please tell your team, well done in making this happen. And our frustration with other parts of your department should not be taken as frustration with your part of the department, because your part of the department is showing how you make sure that our digital infrastructure is modernized and our digital infrastructure is ready for the future. And when you do that, you're able to provide better digital facing services to the American people. So well done. Thank you for your time here, Ms. Harris. It is always a pleasure working with y'all. And if I don't hear any other questions, right, ranking member, then the hearing record is going to remain open for 2 more weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. The response to HHS on MGT will be included in that record, since they will get that back to us within that 2-week period. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stand adjourned.